All right, so today we are diving deep into the fascinating and, let's be honest, often overlooked world of Argentinian ports.
Yeah.
With me to navigate these choppy waters. Is it choppy waters? I don't know. We'll
I'll
see.
figure it out.
Is our expert on all things Argentinian economics and infrastructure.
Guilty's charged.
So we're mainly setting sail with, so to speak, this paper by Enrique Arelli. He calls it, get this, Frontier of National Sovereignty Under Siege.
Catchy, right.
A little bit dramatic, no? What do you think?
Well, he's definitely going for it with that title.
He's making a statement for sure.
But it does make you stop and think, doesn't it? Like, what's so important about these ports that they're under siege?
Exactly.
And it's not just about, ships and containers. Arelli's getting at something bigger here. This idea that control of Argentina's ports is really about control of its future, especially in a globalized world.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. Argentina, we're talking about a country with a massive coastline, over 4,725 kilometers.
That's longer than the entire U.S. West Coast.
It's huge, and it's a vital part of the global trade network.
Absolutely. Anything leaving or entering the South Atlantic, chances are it's passing by Argentina.
Which makes this next part really interesting. Over 70% of Argentina's port terminals are now privately owned.
Privately owned, and here's the kicker, many by foreign companies.
And not just any foreign companies, right? We're talking big agricultural giants like Cargill, Bunge, even international investment funds like BlackRock. These are major global players.
Exactly, and that's what Arelli's getting at. This isn't just about economics, it's about who holds the reins.
So is Argentina essentially selling off its future for, I don't know, a quick influx of cash?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to answer that, we need to dig into this new law. Arelli keeps mentioning the Ley Bases 2024.
Ley Bases 2024. Okay, on the surface, sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a snooze fest, another law.
Right, but trust me, this one's got some teeth.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. What's the big deal with this Ley Bases thing?
So, buried in all legal jargon is this provision called RIGI, régimen de incentivos para grandes inversiones. Basically, a whole bunch of incentives designed to attract massive investments.
Sounds good in theory, right? Attract investment, boost the economy, everyone wins.
Sure, on the surface, but dig a little deeper and you start to see the strings attached.
The strings. Okay, now you've got my attention.
We're talking big tax breaks, regulatory loopholes, the kind of things that make a foreign company very, very happy.
But not so much for Argentina, maybe.
That's what Arelli seems to think. He uses this example of the proposed modernization plan for the Port of Buenos Aires.
Okay, I was reading about that. Big plans, billions of dollars, right?
1.9 billion to be exact.
Right, 1.9 billion. So what's the catch?
The catch is who's doing the modernizing. DP World, a company based in the United Arab Emirates, they're the ones fronting most of the cash.
Okay, and?
And they're getting operational control of the port for 35 years. 35 years. With a possible 15-year extension.
Wow. So basically, they're handing over the keys to a crucial national asset for what could be an entire generation.
Pretty much. And it gets even better or worse depending on how you look at it. DP World is guaranteed a 15% annual return on their investment.
Guaranteed. So even if the port doesn't make that much money.
You got it. The Argentine government is on the hook to pay the difference.
Wow, talk about a sweet deal if you're DP World.
Right. And Arelli, he's done the math. Over the lifetime of that deal, he estimates Argentina could end up paying almost 5 times the initial investment. 5 times. Let that sink in for a minute.
That's a lot of pesos.
To say the least. And remember, that's just one port, one deal. Multiply that across multiple ports, and you start to see the potential for, well, let's just say some serious financial strain.
So is Argentina being lured into this trap? I mean, shiny new ports sound great on paper, but at what cost?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's not just Arelli asking it.
Oh, who else is raising concerns?
Well, he talks about growing discontent within Argentina itself. Labor unions like CUPA, they represent a lot of the port workers. They're pushing back hard.
Makes sense. I mean, if you're a port worker, you're probably worried about your job security.
Absolutely. And it's not just them. Student groups, even some politicians, they're starting to question whether this is a good deal for Argentina in the long run.
It's like you said earlier, this isn't just about economics, it's about control.
Exactly. And you know what makes this whole thing even more complicated?
What's that?
The Falkland Islands. Or, as Argentina calls them, the Islas Malvinas.
Ah, yes, the Falklands.
Mm.
Always a bit of a touchy subject.
To say the least. But it's not just about history here. The fact that a key strategic point in the South Atlantic is controlled by, well, let's just say another nation. It adds a whole other dimension to this discussion.
It's like a shadow hanging over everything we've talked about so far.
Exactly. And that shadow gets even longer when you start to think about the resources at stake in the South Atlantic.
You mean like oil? Fish?
All of the above. But we'll dive into that a bit later.
So we're talking about potential oil and gas reserves, fisheries, shipping lanes, maybe even control of Antarctica.
Yeah.
This is starting to sound like the plot of a geopolitical thriller.
Right. It's like something out of a Tom Clancy novel, but this is real life with real consequences.
And speaking of consequences, let's get back to those shady dealings happening in the ports. O'Reilly uses this phrase, El Dorado of tax evasion, and I've got to admit, it's a bit terrifying. What's he getting at here?
Basically, he's saying that these privatized ports are being used to dodge taxes on a massive scale.
Okay, I'm listening, but like how? What are they doing? Hiding money in shipping containers.
It's more sophisticated than that. Imagine a company claiming they're exporting, say, tons of recycled paper when it's actually undeclared copper. They completely bypass those hefty export taxes.
Clever, but also, wait, illegal.
Very much so.
Yeah.
But since these private companies have a lot of autonomy within the ports, it's really difficult for Argentina to keep a close eye on everything.
Right, because it's not like the government's running the show anymore, is it?
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of capital flight, which is just a fancy way of saying money laundering.
So they're not even paying taxes on the money they're making.
Not if they can help it. They're funneling those profits out of the country as fast as they can.
And Argentina's just supposed to be okay with this?
Well, that's what Aureli's worried about. He found this study. For every dollar exported through these private ports, only 15 cents actually stays in Argentina.
15 cents on the dollar. That's like barely anything. That can't be right.
That's what the study found. It's like this leaky pipeline. The wealth flows through Argentina, but most of it ends up somewhere else.
It's like, if you'll forgive the expression, they're getting screwed.
That's one way to put it. And this is where Aureli's work gets really interesting, because he's not just pointing fingers, he's actually offering solutions. He wants to start a conversation about alternative models for managing Argentina's ports.
Alternative models. So like, what? Nationalize the whole thing.
Not necessarily. He talks about this idea of mixed management. Think of it like a partnership. Argentina retains majority ownership, so they still have the final say, but they bring in a foreign company with expertise in port operations.
So they get the know-how, but they don't have to hand over complete control.
Exactly. He argues that this approach could actually attract more responsible investors.
Investors who aren't just looking to make a quick buck and run.
Precisely, because there's more transparency, more accountability.
Interesting. Okay, what else does he suggest?
He also talks about something called limited concessions.
Limited concessions, okay. So instead of giving one company the keys to the whole port for like, what was it, 50 years?
Yeah, 50 years. Instead of that, you divide the port into specialized terminals. And then you grant concessions to private operators, but only for, say, 10 to 15 years.
With shorter contracts, more competition.
Right. He points to the port of Rotterdam as a successful example of this model.
Rotterdam, that's like the gold standard, right?
Yeah.
One of the busiest, most efficient ports in the world.
Exactly. But O'Reilly takes it even further. He throws out this idea of regional integration.
Regional integration. You're talking about like Argentina teaming up with other South American countries?
Exactly. Imagine a unified South American port network going toe-to-toe with those global shipping giants. It could be a game changer.
That's a powerful idea. But also, let's be real, incredibly difficult to pull off.
For sure, no doubt about it. But it highlights that there are alternative paths forward.
Paths that don't involve Argentina basically becoming an economic colony.
Exactly. But it's going to require some serious political will, both within Argentina and across South America. And it's definitely not going to be easy, especially when you consider the elephant in the room.
The Falklands.
Bingo. Remember that shadow we talked about? It looms especially large over the port of Stanley.
Or as Argentina calls it, Puerto Argentino.
Right. While Argentina's mainland ports are facing all these challenges, the UK has been quietly investing heavily in upgrading the port of Stanley.
Upgrading it? For what? What are they planning to do with it?
Well, it's already a hub for fishing, but there's also the potential for oil and gas exploration.
We're talking about those billions of barrels of oil.
The very same. It's a strategic move by the UK, one that could have major implications for Argentina's maritime ambitions.
Okay, so How does all of this connect back to what we were talking about earlier with the privatization of Argentina's mainland ports?
Think about it like this. If Argentina wants to assert its sovereignty in the South Atlantic,
Which they've made very clear they do.
right, they need to develop a strong maritime presence.
And that starts with having modern, efficient ports.
Exactly. Ports that can compete on a global scale, ports that can project Argentina's economic and political power.
But as we've seen, that's easier said than done.
No kidding. Argentina is facing some tough choices, and the decisions they make about their ports will have long-lasting consequences.
Not just for their economy, but for their place in the world.
Precisely. But what really struck me about Aureli's work is that he doesn't just focus on the big picture stuff, the geopolitics, the economics. He also talks about the human cost of all of this.
Oh, right. We kind of glossed over that earlier. What does he say about how this is all impacting the average Argentine? He doesn't sugarcoat it.
Not one bit. He talks about this massive decline in registered port workers, like a 40% drop over the last 2 decades. Think about that for a second. 40%.
Those are real people, real families.
Exactly. And for those who are still employed, their working conditions, let's just say they're not exactly getting any better. More automation, more reliance on temporary workers.
It's like we've seen in so many industries. The race to the bottom, and it's always the workers who end up paying the price.
Sadly, yes. But going back to what I said earlier, Aureli, he's not just interested in dwelling on the problems, he wants to find solutions.
Okay, so where do we go from here? I mean, we've talked about mixed management, limited concessions, but those feel kind of small scale given the, I don't know, the almost existential challenges Argentina seems to be facing.
Right, and this is where Aureli takes us from the bustling docks of Buenos Aires to the icy waters of the South Atlantic,
Back to the Falklands.
the one and only. He makes this really interesting point that you can't really separate the future of Argentina's ports from the unresolved issue of the Falklands.
I mean, they are intrinsically linked when you think about it, geographically, historically, and I guess economically too, with those potential oil reserves we talked about.
Precisely. And that's not even factoring in the waters surrounding the islands. We're talking about a huge exclusive economic zone, an EEZ, as they call it.
And whoever controls the EEZ controls the resources within it.
You got it. And it's not just about the fish, although those fisheries are incredibly valuable in their own right. But those geological surveys we mentioned earlier, they suggest there could be billions of barrels of oil just waiting to be tapped.
Billions. Okay, now I'm starting to understand why the UK is so reluctant to let go of those islands.
It's not just about a few windswept rocks in the middle of the ocean, is it? We're talking about potentially huge economic and strategic assets.
So what you're saying is that the Falklands dispute isn't just some, I don't know, historical footnote. It's a live issue with real implications for the future.
Absolutely. Control of shipping lanes, access to resources, even the balance of power in the South Atlantic, it's all up for grabs.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. But that's what I appreciate about Aureli's work. He doesn't shy away from these big, complicated issues. He forces us to confront them head on.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, what he's saying is that Argentina can't just focus on upgrading its ports. They need a more comprehensive strategy, one that takes into account these geopolitical realities.
Exactly. He argues that Argentina needs a long-term maritime strategy, something that strengthens their sovereignty, protects their resources, and, crucially, ensures the benefits of all of this, of their maritime wealth, flow back to the Argentine people.
That's a pretty tall order, especially given everything we've talked about today.
Oh, for sure. But I think that's what makes Aureli's work so important. He's not just throwing out complaints, he's issuing a challenge to Argentina, and I'd say to all of us, to think critically about these issues, to demand better from our leaders, and to never, ever take our sovereignty for granted.
It's a powerful message, and one that I think resonates far beyond the, I don't know, the stormy seas of Argentinian politics.
I completely agree. Whether we're talking about Argentina or any other country for that matter, the fight for a more just and equitable world, it's a fight that never really ends. It requires us to be vigilant, to speak out against injustice, and to never stop questioning the status quo.
And on that note, I think we've done our part for today. It's been a deep dive in every sense of the word. But as always, we leave the final thought to you, our listeners. What will you do to protect your own economic future, your own national sovereignty, in a world that's becoming more and more interconnected, more and more complex by the day? Think about it.